Okay, thank you. Thank you to all who helped make it possible for my online people. So, we're going to talk about the post-World War II period in America. So the domestic 1950s, or really the late 1940s and into the 50s. And we'll talk about something I'll define as the suburban ideal. We'll talk about what does that mean and what does it mean for different Americans. And then I will tie that in with a discussion of how America continues to develop as a consumer culture. We've already touched on this twice. So we'll see, how does America take yet one more step towards becoming a full-on consumer culture. We'll talk about home ownership and the automobile, which make this suburban ideal possible. We'll talk about women in the domestic sphere as homemaker. And then the last of the lecture, we'll talk about kind of some elements of a rebellious culture that reject, in one way or another, the suburban ideal. And that'll include a discussion of rock and roll music and artists like Elvis Presley. First, though, this is a period that some would characterize as a golden age of capitalism. A period of serious economic prosperity if we look at the macroeconomic indicators or numbers. So the GDP is going up. Value of stocks is going up. Unemployment is historically low. Corporate profits are going up. Remember, we looked at a lot of this in the so-called roaring 1920s too, but there were those structural flaws that we identified that were going to come to a head in the Depression. Here, you don't have those same structural flaws. So take, for example, we looked at in the 20s, corporate profits were going up, but wages did not go up. Well, wages do go up here in this period. And so what you see in terms of economic prosperity and growth, and also, yes, stability, is that it's more enduring, more long-lasting, number one. And number two, it's also more top to bottom. So we see improvements in quality of life or living conditions, not just for wealthy people or middle-class people, but for working-class people as well. This would be the first time that in American history you could go throughout the country, and even with people who were pretty poor, working-class folks, at least they have things like electricity and indoor plumbing in the home, right? And they make probably at least some semblance of a livable wage. But meanwhile, for middle-class people, if they have the money to spend, they can purchase all kinds of new amenities that would make life easier or better. This is the ideal sort of suburban family homes kitchen. What do we see in there that would be commonplace now for us, but not so much 30, 40 years before this? Yeah, and I know nowadays it's rare to see that the electric oven is not a one piece with the stovetop, the electric stovetop, but there you've got that, right? What else? Yeah, well, actually, I don't know if there is a dishwasher, but that is an answer. This is around the time you would have dishwasher. You don't see this here either, but washer and dryer for your clothes as opposed to the old wash bucket and the washboard. Refrigerator, right? And the running water in the sink. You got the old-time mixer there, electric mixer. Telephone is now in every home, and I'm no longer relying on the telegraph or telegrams. All kinds of stuff like this during this period becomes commonplace in middle-class family homes. And there are other things to consider outside of the home. Obviously, as we're going to see, this suburban ideal version of the American dream that gives us this is not possible without automobile and obviously the ability to own this home. And so the automobile revolution continues, but at the same time, you have for the first time commercial jet travel for the first time. So I should say a lot of this goes hand in hand with continuing to embrace debt, like individual debt, and looking at that as a means of, personal credit. And so we have for the first time in the 1950s banks issuing credit cards to purchase a lot of this stuff, or to purchase whatever. At the same time, as you'll see, as you saw last time, we did the Cold War last time, yes? America is settling into the Cold War during this period with the Soviet Union, and there's always that threat of that potential World War III scenario that maybe wouldn't involve atomic or maybe nuclear weapons, but could theoretically involve, a traditional war of arms between the United States and the Soviet Union, or as we saw, these proxy wars, one of which occurs right in the dead middle of this period, the Korean War. So America's building up its military, and will continue to do so, really from this point up to this present day, to have America's military at a state of ever readiness. Never again would we go back to serious reduction in terms of standing strength of our armed forces unless we go to war. Our armed forces are always at the ready. And this gives rise to a military-industrial complex. That is a close working relationship between the American government and our military, what gets rebranded during this period, the Department of Defense, and corporations. Corporations that produce the technology that our military uses. And from this moment that we're looking at to the present day, that technology constantly is advancing. And so you're talking about corporations like Boeing that make jet engines or aircraft for the military, for just one example. They would get contracts from the government to build those. And in talking about a military-industrial complex, it's a term actually coined by the man who was president for most of this period, Dwight Eisenhower, who'd been the head of all Allied forces in World War II. And Eisenhower was meaning to describe it for what it is, this close relationship between the American government and corporations that produce stuff for the military, but also to say it could be dangerous. That's a pretty big open window for the possibility of corruption in terms of government contracts for billions of dollars going to build this stuff, and so be careful with it, I think was all he was saying. Finally, well, let me add one last thing to that. A lot of new bases are open, particularly in the South and in the West. And that allows for, growth and advancement in those areas. Ton of bases opened up here where we are in the deep South and west of here. At the same time, you see a real uptick in the commercialization of agriculture. Look at this graph. It's the number of farms in the U.S. Note that this doesn't say anything about the number of acres of farmland. Let's just assume for argument's sake that that doesn't really change in the period of time that they're looking at here. Like the actual area of land being cultivated, roughly the same. And if we're looking at its cutoff, if we're looking at the start of the 20th century, you're looking at over 6 million farms. And then beginning in the 30s and 40s and down eventually to the 70s, that number reduces drastically to almost just 2 million. So from over 6 to 2 million in several decades' time, what's happening is you're moving away from the old paradigm of the old settler family that has their own little family farm. And remember, during the Depression, a lot of those folks lost their farm. When banks acquired those through that kind of situation, or if a family otherwise sold the farm and moved, what they do is sell it more often than not to a corporation, to a company that then owns a massive corporate farm and hires wage-earning workers or sometimes migrant workers to come and work on that farm using new heavy machinery that's available, like tractors and reapers and whatnot. And so largely gone are the old days of the family who settled out on the plains and had their little family farm and grew, a few acres of wheat or cotton and raised cattle and hogs or whatever. Now we have these huge corporate farms. Does that make sense? Or ranches, for that matter. What is then this suburban ideal? Well, like I alluded to earlier, it's a version of the American dream that the goal of which is to see the nuclear family together. And I use nuclear here, not like nuclear weapons, but the nucleus of the family is the husband, who is the breadwinner. He works at the corporate job, a so-called white-collar job. His automobile allows him to do that because they live in a suburb. This is a community of mostly residential area, mostly homes, middle-class people living outside of a city, in some other county or otherwise outside of the city limits, getting away from the hustle and bustle of downtown. And they own this home. The mother is the homemaker, the housewife. She does not work. She raises and tends to the children and tends to the home. So she is then thought to be, expected to be confined to the domestic sphere, as I was saying earlier. And the children, and by this time we have, throughout America, generally free, compulsory K through 12 public school. So they go to school at day, and the housewife then is at home by herself for most of the day, theoretically cooking and cleaning and what have you, and they have the white picket fence and the lawn and all of that. That makes sense? Obviously, not everyone embraces the suburban ideal, number one. We'll look at some people who reject it in various ways. Also, it's not available to everyone. And we'll look at what are the limitations on who can attain this version of the American dream. This is part and parcel, though, of America developing as a consumer culture, because remember, our base definition was a society in which people purchase the things they need instead of making them themselves. And remember, from the start, that involved corporations trying to tell you, you need fill in the blank. All of this other stuff is going to make your life better, fulfilling, easier. At the heart of the suburban ideal is the notion that you need to buy this home. And depending on who you are and what you look like, the government might help you do that, especially if you fought in the war. It can be assistance for government-backed loans for home ownership. Again, depending on who and where we're talking about. But also, you need that automobile. You have to purchase that car to be able to make this possible. It's not like when you live in the city and you could walk to work or to school or wherever. You live in that suburban community, you got to drive. And sure, maybe they opened a shopping mall in your suburban community, so you don't have to go downtown to go to the Woolworths or the Crest or the Sears anymore, but you do got to drive to the mall. And then maybe you need a television, right? The television during this period replaces the radio as the centerpiece of the living room. And it has now all kinds of programs built on the old radio program. So obviously there's news on the television. There's sports, like baseball on the television. There's drama. There's soap operas on during the day. There's variety shows on at night and game shows. And there are westerns that are on in the prime time in the evening. And there are, in fact, shows that we would come to call situational comedies or sitcoms, like Leave It to Beaver, for example, or Dennis the Menace, that then show you the version of what you feel like is a suburban ideal being piped back to you on that television, because it's about a nuclear family, a white nuclear family, living in the suburbs and living the American dream. And of course, what's on between all of these programs? Commercials. Telling you about all kinds of other shit that you need to make your life fulfilling, right? You need this ottoman or this chair or that lamp or all of the things that we looked at in the kitchen. You need this set of cookware, right? Or this baking pan or an electric vacuum or whatever it may be. And if you've got the credit card or you're otherwise embracing debt, you can buy that stuff because the husband has the steady salary and you can make payments on that and be okay. You guys recognize either of these individuals? I know it's probably blurry. Or otherwise, do you know either number one, who was Eisenhower's vice president? I don't know if he was for both terms, but if you can name either one of them. Or who replaced Stalin in the Soviet Union? Because that's who we're looking at. The guy who became premier when Stalin died and the man who this time was the vice president.
Reagan?
Not yet. Reagan, I think, was still acting. This was just before he would have come up in California politics and become governor. And so he probably was on a camera somewhere. That is on the right, Richard Nixon. On the left, let me test myself here. I think that's right. That is Nikita Khrushchev, the premier of the Soviet Union. Not a murderous lunatic like Stalin, but, he's still the Soviet premier. He's still, more or less a dictator. But we have, even though we're in the Cold War, we do have diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union. As part of our diplomatic relations with the Soviet Union, we agreed for both nations to host a kind of showcase, if you will. Like, we would send a delegation to Moscow, and they would show off, like, this is what's great about communism, the classless society, we're all comrades and equal. This is what's great about Soviet Russia. And then they send a delegation to us, and we're like, this is what's great about capitalism and democracy, Suburban Ideal. And at our exhibition, there's this model kitchen that very much looks like the two images of kitchens that we've seen in here already. That one, that, and that one. And what happens with Nixon and Khrushchev here is an impromptu debate breaks out while they're standing there, and they've got this, actress playing this American housewife. Nixon is trying to say, look at this, look how easy life is. This is the average American. These are not rich people. And look, she's got a dishwasher, got a refrigerator. Look at the washer and dryer. Doesn't have to worry with the washboard and tub and whatnot. And Khrushchev is like, yeah, but segregation, inequality, this woman is confined to a domestic role and so on, whereas women are just comrades in Russia like everybody else. And Nixon kind of then stands up to him. It's not like an argument. It's a healthy debate, but it helped propel Nixon later to become president in terms of his popularity. But here's the key takeaway. At one point, Nixon says, this is what American freedom is. The essence of American freedom is the ability to choose which products are going to make your life better, easier, more fulfilling. In essence, then, Nixon defines freedom as consumer choice. Think about that connection of capitalism to American democracy. Or to think about it this way, if you were to say American freedom is, or the essence of American freedom is, all the other things you might say, the right to vote, theoretical equality of citizens, a representative government, right? No, Nixon says the essence of American freedom is consumer choice. You don't get more consumer culture than that. When we've now reached the point where the American vice president says, at the very heart of American freedom is this ability to choose which products to purchase to make our lives better, easier, more fulfilling. That's maybe even the zenith of being at the top of being a consumer culture. And that's, of course, at the heart then of this suburban ideal. Does that make sense? Needless to say, there's massive suburban growth during this time. I want you to think about this from a couple of angles. One, right now out here, for those of you that live out here, you live in what would probably be more accurately called an exurb, like a suburb of a suburb of a suburb. We're on the outer edge of the Atlanta metropolitan area. Where, early planned suburbs would be like within the 285 perimeter. Suburbs that grow during this time are just outside of that perimeter. So think Cobb County, Gwinnett County, I guess eventually Rockdale County. But then growth there subsumes areas like what had once been just a little town way outside of Atlanta, Covington, that is now part of greater Atlanta, if that makes sense. But I want you to go back to what I was just saying. Think Cobb County, Gwinnett County, Eastern DeKalb, and then eventually Rockdale, Clayton County, Douglas County. None of that growth happens as it does without the interstate highway system, without 85, without 75, without 20, without eventually 285. So a lot of this is being facilitated by the federal government committed to building the interstate highway system. It's known, if you ever pay attention, I guess you wouldn't be paying attention because they're so infrequent, but maybe one day you'll notice or have noticed sometimes on the interstate, just randomly, you'll see a sign that says Eisenhower Interstate Highway System, because it was built during this time, during Eisenhower's presidency. It allows the suburbs to grow, and it allows those who can afford the automobile and who can get the mortgage and who are able to sign that mortgage and move into that neighborhood. It gives those people the ability to obtain this dream of home ownership. And like I said, remember too, the federal government is subsidizing this and giving veterans government-backed loans, and I'm going to put an asterisk on there because you probably can see where this is going. Final point there on the first bullet, though, we already talked about how during the Gilded Age, America goes from a predominantly rural agrarian society in which people live on farms or in rural areas to one in which most people live in cities. Now, we've gone beyond that to where most people live in suburbs rather than in the cities. And it has remained that way ever since. Consider too, though, again, women's role in this. We had a robust discussion about this in my honors US class. Then that class is predominantly women, and most of them rejected this suburban ideal version of the American dream out of hand because it would require that women don't seek education and that they prepare for a life as a housewife or a homemaker, and most of them said they did not want to do that. I did have a young man in that class whose family are from Mexico, and he said, look, in my culture, this is actually something I aspire to. There was back and forth, and I think eventually it settled into, look, if certain people, if a woman and a man, or a man and a man, or whoever want to do this and live out this version of the dream, that's fine. But, for most of us, it's not for me, right? We considered some other angles. So, one, yes, the woman is confined to the domestic sphere, both theoretically or metaphorically, and quite literally. You think about during the day, man's off at work, kids are at school. You don't live in a city where you've got neighbors in your apartment complex, like right next door, that you interact with every day. You would have to sort of proactively go out, knock on the door of your neighbor, call them up on the phone, join a neighborhood organization or something, right? In order to have even friends and daily communication. That said, a lot of women did precisely that. One student in the last class pointed this out. And you don't just take it for whatever it is. And obviously, I don't support this as the ideal version of the American dream. But consider, if the essence of American freedom is consumer choice, who is there for most of the day with the television on, watching the commercials and making the decisions about what to buy to go into that home to make life, better, easier, more fulfilling? Who is the vehicle for consumer choice of the essence of American freedom? It's the woman in the home. So just another way to look at it. That being said, there are going to be a lot more kids. While those women were off working in factories and men were off in the war effort, and finally you can settle down again. You can imagine when you settle into that home, maybe one of the first things you're going to do would lead to procreation. And so a lot of babies born, a huge increase in births in these years, the baby boom of which my parents were both a part. They were born in 47 and 49. So right after the war was over. So yes, I am one generation removed from being a boomer. I was told that I'm right on the edge of X and millennial. 81. What would you consider that? They said Gen X goes up to 80 and like millennial starts around 81. I don't consider myself a millennial though. I mean, I'm like late stage Gen X, I guess. It doesn't matter. Anyway, I don't even know what generation we're on anymore. So, I've been alluding to some things that are kind of pushing us towards understanding one key element of what's happening here. Not everybody obviously can afford homes. Not everybody can afford the automobile. But more importantly, even if you could, the ability to live in these communities depends on your race, what you look like. There were, even going back to the New Deal, the federal government, when it began to subsidize housing for the first time, it made maps of cities, including Atlanta. You could look this up. That were for banks to use to consider who to lend to for home ownership. And in all of those maps, the black neighborhoods were in red, and it said do not lend to these people. They call it redlining. So it's already established that the federal government is at least complicit for segregation in cities. Now, what happens when we're growing out into the suburbs? There are racial covenants. That is, for a lot of these neighborhoods, there are covenants or agreements you have to sign that says, I will not sell this home to a person of color. There are also real estate agents you have to go to who could simply refuse to work with people of color. There are homeowners associations. There's obviously the banks themselves that you have to go through. All kinds of roadblocks that keep these suburbs as white as possible. And you think about a metro area like Atlanta today is obviously incredibly diverse. Even the suburbs. You can go to a place like Latonia and it's largely African American. You go to Clarkston and it's a lot of people from parts of Africa that are immigrants. You go to Chamblee and it's a lot of Latinos. You go to Duluth, it's a lot of East Asian people, and so on. Back then, this was not the case. Back then, the suburbs were 99% white in most of these places. And it was by design, and it was enforced by the federal government would back loans for white people in white communities and only back loans for black families in other black communities, which remained at that time largely still within the city. Cities, plural. So there's widespread housing discrimination. And there is also, in 1954, the Supreme Court hands down its decision in the case of Brown versus Board of Education. And the court in Brown said it is unconstitutional to have legally segregated schools or public school systems. So, as someone who has written a book about this, I can tell you with some authority that for about 20 years, this led to very little, and in some cases, none, integration. There is, in fact, a huge backlash against it, part of which involves white flight, and that is white people who live in cities that have large populations of black or brown people that when Brown is handed down or faced with the prospect of actually being forced to go to racially integrated schools instead of the all-white ones they'd always gone to, and rather than face that possibility, they leave the city and move to the suburbs, because remember what I just said, back then the suburbs are all white. You're in a city, a town, another county, a different school system. You don't have to worry about integration because there are no black or brown people out there to go to school with at that time. Meanwhile, when those folks leave the city, they take with them tax money. And I'm not just talking about property taxes for homes that are going to be purchased by probably other minorities in what had been white communities. But I mean like sales tax dollars, because I remember I told you about the shopping mall phenomenon, and all that sales tax money is going to stay in the suburbs instead of coming into the city. And a lot of times that's money that gets used to help with things like education, where a school system is going to become a majority, if not total minority, because all of the white people have left. And then there are practices like blockbusting. You look at a community like the West End in Atlanta, which now is gentrifying, which is a whole nother conversation that we won't have right now, but which for a long time has been almost exclusively a black community, but back before this time was an exclusively white community, where at one point they literally put up barricades in the street to keep people out. But at one point, there's essentially a conspiracy between homeowners and realtors to spread rumors that, you know, you've lost the fight, this neighborhood is going to see minorities moving in, property values are going to plummet, everybody needs to sell before that happens. And you then gin up this movement to sell homes and to move out of this neighborhood. You turn around and you, in some cases, you could sell then homes to people of color, or if the original home owner retained ownership, you could then rent to those people if they couldn't afford. But the essence of it, what used to be a white community within 10 years can become, in the case of the West End, all black by way of these practices like blockbusting. And of course, this goes hand in hand with not just segregated education that we've already talked about, but employment discrimination as well. I don't have my notes today, but if I did, I would have the numbers for you in terms of the percentage of white versus black or brown people in white-collar jobs, that is, earning a salary as opposed to working for an hourly wage. It is grossly disproportionate as a result of employment discrimination, which of course goes hand in hand with segregated education if segregated schools don't have the same resources as white schools. Oh, one thing I failed to mention. Remember I told you when we first started talking about assembly line and mass production, like that's eventually applied to everything. During this time, that even means homes, prefabricated homes where you could mass produce the parts and then throw them up real quick, and they're cheap, and that way more people can afford them. So home ownership could become attainable for more people. Same thing as with the Model T Ford. This would be in communities like those designed by William Levitt, or Levitt towns. There's multiple of them up in the Northeast. So you have the parts to make basically like 4 home designs, and you change them very little aesthetically, but it's, all of those homes are basically the same floor plan. So that they're mass produced and that they're more affordable. But yeah, so somebody like Levitt would buy this huge tract of land and subdivide it, hence a subdivision. And then, you know, have racial covenants that say no black or brown people can live in this community.
Couldn't you order homes from Sears?
Yeah. I mean, that's the zenith of mass production. I mean, you'd open up a Sears catalog and be like, that's the home I want to buy. And
I lived in one for a little while.
did you really? Where at?
In California.
Wow, that's
like
amazing.
It was a small little house.
Probably built during this period, yeah.
So cheap.
Got like the linoleum counters and floors and the dark wooden wall that's not really a wall, it's like a paper thin board. Yeah. Well, let's talk about some challenges to the suburban ideal. First of all, culturally speaking, that baby boom generation, these kids that are born right after the war in the late 40s, by the end of the 50s and of course continuing into the 60s, they have adopted a rebellious culture that rejects the suburban ideal. Look, if you had gone off and fought World War II or spent 5 years working in a factory, that would be perhaps appealing to you, the quiet life in the suburbs and the white picket fence and whatnot. But if you grew up in that life, then maybe you would want something different. Perhaps you weren't sure what that was. And maybe like the James Dean film, you were a rebel without a cause. I rebel against the suburban ideal. I reject the idea I'm supposed to, if I'm a boy, go to school and get a corporate job and settle down with a family. And if I'm a woman, I don't go to school and I get married and I have kids and live as a homemaker. Maybe you didn't want to do that. Part and parcel of that culture is rock and roll music, which is seen as just scandalous to their parents' generation, as is often the case. Now, rock and roll is a fundamental outgrowth of, more than anything else, two kinds of music, jazz and blues. Jazz and blues are both African-American cultural creations, as we've talked about in here before. Some of the earliest rock and roll musicians, some of the pioneers of rock music who played electric guitars are black people like Chuck Berry. And Chuck Berry became a star and had hits on the radio, but he's a black man in 1950s America. Unlike Elvis, who is white and starts playing this kind of music and becomes America's first musical superstar. The white boy from Mississippi, and often credited with being the father of rock and roll, when really musically he had very little contribution in that regard. He just started playing mostly music that already existed. And he did have a great voice. He did have a very flamboyant way of dancing around on the stage that mothers found to be very scandalous, with his gyrations and whatnot. It wouldn't be anything to us. But back then, the mothers are covering their children's eyes, and the cameras eventually would only show him from the waist up, on TV and whatnot. But he becomes, of course, a great superstar. I don't know how we got on this tangent in my last class, but it was pointed out that I think he married a girl who was like 14. And then I added that Jerry Lee Lewis, another young white boy, married a girl who was like 12, didn't he?
It was his cousin.
And it was his cousin on top of it. And these guys were superstars. And then, of course, Elvis gets addicted to all kinds of prescription drugs. He gets heavy, shall we say, and by the late 70s was extremely unhealthy. Late stage Elvis. That's rough. One of the things about Elvis is, he was already, they call him the king of rock and roll or whatever. He was, again, America's first musical just superstar. But he was obsessed with being an actor too, and he wasn't particularly good at acting. And so he's in I don't know, a dozen or more really bad movies because he wanted to be, he wanted to be Marlon Brando in addition to being the king of rock and roll. Anyway, what does Playboy magazine have to do with anything? Well, it was first published in 1957, pornographic magazine. You would only read it for the articles, right? Yeah. It's true now because, with the internet, who buys print magazine porn anymore? So they actually only have articles now, as I understand it. This is what I'm to understand. What is the point? How does this tie in? It's a fantasy escape from the mundane suburban ideal for the man of the house, right? And it's no coincidence that 57 is the year that it's published and it takes off and becomes a widely selling magazine. Who's that on the front there?
Marilyn Monroe.
Indeed, yeah. Young actress.
Do you have an example of the pages in the PowerPoint?
I'm sure you could find. I'm sure you could easily find some of those with your little smartphone there. Maybe not on university Wi-Fi though. Maybe disconnect, go on air, and then do it. Which, by the way, you could also. I've always wanted to do a dramatic reading of a poem written by Allen Ginsberg called Howl. HOWL, exclamation point, like howl at the moon. But number one, it's really long. It would take up like half the class period. And number two, there are some things in there that, I don't know, people might go home and tell their parents and they'd be like, that guy's doing what? He said what? Howl was about Ginsberg and his friends who were called the Beats. And they're called the Beats because they feel like they're beaten down by this idea of this suburban ideal. And that's supposed to be what America and American freedom are all about. You feel like they're beaten down by that idea. And they're writers is what connects them. Ginsberg being a poet. Jack Kerouac is a novelist. Another one you could put down, William Burroughs, Burroughs, Burroughs. They would look at that suburban community, that subdivision at night, and see the families gather around the television watching the same mundane programs and the same commercials. And they would flatly reject this idea that materialism is what it's about to be American. The idea that the essence of American freedom and what's supposed to make our lives complete is buying stuff. You know, for them it had to be about something more, and they, like the rebel without a cause idea, they're not sure what that is, but they're going to explore and try to find that out. And that might mean experimenting with drugs, and a lot of different kinds. That might mean experimenting sexually. That might mean traveling far and wide throughout America and maybe even abroad. That might mean experimenting with religions that are not, common in America, like Buddhism, to try to get at what is life really about, what is America really about. And so Jack Kerouac writes On the Road, which is the most famous of all the Beat pieces of literature about his and others of his Beat generation, traveling around America, going into jazz clubs and listening to what was then called bop, a really intense and highly experimental form of jazz that helped give birth to rock and roll, doing all kinds of drugs, traveling even from Denver down to Mexico and experiencing that. And then Ginsberg, Howl, I mentioned, is similar, but it talks about how these experiences drove a lot of these people mad and crazy. There's actually a great refrain in there. There's three major parts. In the last part, he's talking about there was this one guy, one of the Beats, and his name escapes, Carl Solomon, that's it, to whom Howl is dedicated. He got himself committed to a mental institution, just to see what it was like. And back then they would do shit like electroshock therapy that you would never do now. And so that was a bad deal. And it was called Rockland something or other, the psychiatric facility. And so the refrain in the third part of the poem is, I'm with you in Rockland, da, 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 I'm with you in Rockland, da, 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 da. I think about it every time I cross the Rockdale County border, and I always think I'm going to write like a parody of Howl where I talk about everything that's fucked up about Rockdale County in a poem. But needless to say, I have not done it. Anyway, read Howl if you get a chance. If all of this sounds like the hippies, there's a reason for that. There would be, in the 1960s and 70s, there wouldn't have been the counterculture that we call the hippies without the Beats first. They sort of laid the foundation for the counterculture of the 1960s and early 70s. Questions? Anything at all? All right, well, in that case, talk about the Cold War at home during the 1950s. If you read NSC 68, and you will for the quiz, or when you read, I should say, NSC 68, this Security Council memorandum, this government document, they lay out what the American government had taken from George Kennan and his lessons about the Soviet Union and the way that they think, and run with it to the point of seeing the world as divided between liberty or freedom and capitalism on the one hand, and communism and slavery on the other hand. This binary world in which there's no room for gray or no room for in between. And that really raises the stakes if you think about it. Any possibility of the spread of communism in the world was seen as a grave threat to American freedom. That's the Truman Doctrine, remember. That's the reason for the containment policy. And at the same time, any hint of communism spreading or fomenting or growing within America, within our own borders, was terrifying for some people too. And there develops this great fear that there are communist spies in America working on behalf of the Soviet Union. It does not help that in at least 2 cases, it looks like there actually were. A man named Alger Hiss was found to be spying for the Soviet Union and working within the American State Department. Remember, the State Department at the federal level is responsible for our diplomats and our embassies and our international relations. Not a good place to discover that there is a Soviet spy. Another good place, or bad, I should say, place to discover that there are Soviet spies would be the Manhattan Project. If you remember from the World War II lecture, that is the project that developed the atomic bomb. And it turns out that Julius and Ethel Rosenberg, who worked on that project, were passing some of the atomic secrets developed there to the Russians. This only fuels a second Red Scare, a second example like we had in the 20s of this, in some cases, irrational terror about the possibility of the spread of communism either internationally or within America. And in particular, there's this obsession over where are the other spies. And Congress tries to act on that. We know this beyond a shadow of a doubt in the times in which we now live. When there is fear, politicians will exploit that for their own benefit, for their own power and gain. And certainly that was the case here. The House of Representatives in Congress forms HUAC, or the House Un-American Activities Commission, to investigate this possibility, to have public hearings and to subpoena people and force them to come and testify. Who do you know? Who's a communist spy? Who do you know that's a communist sympathizer? Give us names. In the Senate, they do the same thing under the leadership of a senator from Wisconsin named Joseph McCarthy. McCarthy claims to have a list. Says, I have a list of, 200 people working in the American government who are communist spies. And we're going to call forth all these witnesses, and I'm going to point my finger at them and badger them and make them tell us who they are. I want you to admit it, who's on this list. It's a complete fabrication. A lie. There was no list. But they hold hearings for months. McCarthy becomes this big name because he's seen as tough on communism. His political star is rising until gradually it becomes clear that there is no list. There's no one that's been proven to be a communist spy at all. And once people started to realize that, McCarthy's response was to just double down on it and to start pointing his finger at people in high positions in the American government, including in the Army. At one point, he makes the completely outrageous suggestion that maybe Eisenhower himself is a communist sympathizer. And once he started doing stuff like that, the people started to realize him for what he was, and the house of cards comes tumbling down pretty quickly. His career is over or ruined, and his name is forever synonymous with this kind of fear-mongering, with the political exploitation of fear or mass hysteria for your own political gain, even by lying about it. Anybody, I don't know if I asked this at the very beginning of the semester or not, because I consolidated our colonial lectures, but when we did Colonial New England, did I ask, who's read The Crucible? Who's had any dealings with the crucible? The text is about the Salem witch trials, right? But this is what he was writing about in the subtext, was exactly what was happening in his own day and time, which is similar to what those girls were doing in Salem, which is exploiting people's fear of witchcraft. Here it's the fear of the spread of communism, and the same exact thing. Okay, finally. So you know that the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki in 1945 in order to get the Japanese to surrender. 2 years later, the Soviet Union successfully tested their own atomic bomb. A few years after that, the United States successfully tested a hydrogen bomb. The hydrogen bomb is not an atomic weapon, it is a thermonuclear weapon. And it is much more destructive. And think about, you saw what that one atomic bomb did to the city of Hiroshima, and it flattened it. And consider that now we have nuclear weapons, thermonuclear weapons, the hydrogen bomb, that are thousands of times more powerful than that. It's terrifying. And a couple years after the United States successfully tested theirs, the Soviet Union successfully tested their own. So by the mid-1950s, both sides have thermonuclear weapons. The difference is, and I took physics like 23 years ago, so we'll keep it real simple. The original atomic bomb worked through nuclear fission, the splitting of an atom. A thermonuclear weapon uses a combined process of initial nuclear fission that then results in nuclear fusion and a sustained sort of chain reaction process, so that it's fission and fusion in the thermonuclear weapon. What's more, by the end of the 50s and going into the 60s, both sides have ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles. These are missiles that can carry a warhead, a nuclear warhead, a bomb, at an incredibly high speed into a low Earth orbit for hundreds or thousands of miles and attack a target. And when both sides have them, and we deploy them in Western Europe, the Soviets deploy them in Eastern Europe, we want to keep up with them in terms of how many they have so that we've got just as many, and vice versa. The concept of nuclear deterrence leads to a nuclear arms race. Nuclear deterrence means you want to deter the enemy from striking you. You want to convince them not to, in other words. Because they would know that you have just as many nukes as they do. And if they launched a strike, you could retaliate with the exact same number. So if they launched an initial strike and destroyed 5 American cities, or rather, we're not quite at the point where they could strike American cities, but if they wanted to destroy London, Paris, I don't know, Hamburg, and Brussels, they would know that you could turn around instantly and destroy Warsaw and maybe St. Petersburg, or fill in the blank Russian city. So they would tend to not want to do that for that reason, but that only works if you keep up. And so it becomes this race to build more and more and more and more. And then eventually both sides have hundreds and then thousands of these weapons. It gets to the point where you'd have to consider that, if one side struck the other side retaliated, you retaliated for that, and it went back and forth, or if, God forbid, everybody launched all of their weapons, you'd probably destroy one another. I mean, you could literally destroy each other in this way. What's more, you have to think theoretically and scientifically about the possibility of all of that radiation being released could block out the sun for a period of time and result in the death of all life on Earth, which would be mutually assured destruction and nuclear holocaust. which is thankfully why this has never happened. Because these are the stakes, if you will. That leads to a lot of anxiety. People start building fallout shelters in the backyard with canned goods and water. You could possibly live out the radiation fallout from a nuclear strike or have protection from that blast under the ground. Kids in school are told to duck and cover under their desk in case of an attack, as if that's going to save you from a nuclear explosion. And just to underscore the anxiety, and we've got a couple minutes left. All right, so, I put us in Atlanta, how useful. Okay, so let's just see, what if, let's just take the little boy, like the type deployed on Hiroshima, or Hiroshima as I'm told it's pronounced. Be terrible, okay, so fireball radius is a lot of downtown campus. That's everything's incinerated there. Heavy blast damage radius is pretty bad. That's where everything's destroyed. Radiation fallout from State Farm Arena to our GSU stadium down here and up to Sweet Auburn. Thermal radiation, the 3rd degree burn radius here up in Divine City in Old 4th Ward, and then light blast damage, so, you know, like moderate destruction all the way up into Midtown and out to Bankhead and the West End and whatnot. That's pretty bad. Let's see. Where's the estimated casualties?
Oh, I think it was up top.
You have said to airbrush, you'll have to change it to casualties.
Oh, wait, yeah. Wait, hit surface. Still going.
All right, that's bad. That would be obviously horrible. Having said that,
What's up the ante?
so bear in mind that this is the largest, we eventually, the US and Soviet Union agreed to stop testing. I don't think that means we stopped developing. So this is just the largest one we know about that either one of us has ever tested somewhere. They do it, or they used to do it out in Siberia. We would do it out in the Pacific after we stopped doing it in the desert, thinking, a lot of radiation here. Let's go drop it on an island where SpongeBob lives. So this would be what we have now.
Oh my god.
Yeah, Covington's gone.
Oh my god.
That's in Atlanta too.
Oh my god.
Yeah. So the thermal, the incineration zone is now basically the entire city of Atlanta gone. The total blast, like everything hurricane, tornado style damage zone is pretty much all the inner ring suburbs. So everything from Roswell to Fayetteville, Jonesboro to Conyers. Douglasville in the west. And then we are squarely within the thermal radiation radius where 3rd degree burns extend throughout the layers of skin, destroy the nerves, cause scarring, disablement, require amputation. 100% probability for 3rd degree burns. This yield is such and such. And then the light blast damage radius
Hits Athens.
is from Athens to Rome to LaGrange and Thomaston. Glass windows expected to break, injuries, blindness, and so on.
That's from an airburst.
So that's 2 million.
From an airburst.
1.6.
How about a surface detonation? Wow.
Is airbrush really going to the sky?
Yes, it's where it blows up in the sky. Surface is just like it smashes the ground and
Yeah.
explodes.
So this is one good reason not to go to war with. Now the Russians still have a lot of these weapons, so.
You can turn on the radioactive fallout too.
Huh?
You can turn on the radioactive fallout too, see where all that hits. You know,
Depends on where the air or the wind blows.
Yeah.
Right? Look at that.
You want to see? It goes all the way up to like North. No, yeah, go past North Carolina. Like up to DC.
Well, that's horrifying.
Yes.
That's just from one.
Happy Tuesday. All right. See you later.
We're gonna friends go down.